The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of the supply depot, casting long beams of light across stacks of crates, clipboards, and coiled chains. The air inside was thick with the smell of engine grease, cardboard, and military coffee that had been sitting on a burner too long. Inside, soldiers moved with routine indifference, lugging boxes and shouting orders, their boots thudding rhythmically on the concrete floor. At the center of it all stood Marie Reiner, her silver-gray hair tightly tied back in a regulation bun. She moved slowly, but with precision, checking serial numbers and shipping logs on a battered clipboard. Her uniform, faded but spotless, carried the rank of a retired sergeant major now serving in a civilian logistics role. Her back was straight, her posture composed, but the lines around her eyes hinted at years most of the others in the room couldn't begin to imagine. "Hey, Grandma, make sure you don't pull a muscle," one of the younger privates called out from the loading ramp, nudging his friend and laughing. The friend laughed along but more hesitantly, his glance lingering on Marie for a moment. Then necessary, perhaps sensing that the joke didn't quite sit right. Marie didn't respond. She adjusted her clipboard, stepped around a scattered toolkit, and continued her walk toward the freight manifest table. Her boots were quieter than the rest, her presence oddly muted in a room filled with chatter and metallic clangs. It wasn't that she was ignored. It was that she had become part of the background, like the shelves, the ropes, the forklifts, and the heavy crates. Necessary, always there, but rarely acknowledged. Another private leaned over to a corporal, nodding toward Marie. "She's been here since my brother enlisted. Heard she never made it past logistics. Probably got demoted. I mean, look at her, she's what, 70? She's on contract civilian now." They both laughed and shook their heads, returning to their task of inventorying rations. Marie moved past them, placing a corrected requisition form into a tray. She glanced at the schedule board near the entrance. In red letters, "Base inspection, General Darnell." She looked at her watch. 35 minutes. A corporal from engineering approached, waving a sheet of paper. "Sergeant Reiner, Miss Reiner, this says we're only getting 2 spools of thermal cable. We ordered 4. She scanned it quickly, nodded once. "You entered the wrong product code. 1 digit off. I'll correct it." The corporal frowned, defensive. "I'm sure I didn't." "You did," she said, still calm. "Line 27. You typed 74,651 instead of 74,615. That 1 digit changes the cable gauge." He opened his mouth, thought better of it, then left without another word. Marie returned to her paperwork. Her hand paused for a second as she reached into the inner pocket of her vest and took out a small folded photograph. She looked at it briefly, her expression softening. It was a black and white shot of a small tactical team, all wearing gear that looked worn but sharp. Their faces were obscured or blurred by where the only clear face was hers, standing in. The back row, helmet off, eyes serious. Tucked in the corner of the photo was a patch, worn and unfamiliar, the kind of insignia that didn't appear in standard military handbooks. She placed the photo back into her vest, tucked neatly beneath her shirt. Her hand brushed the patch sewn just above her hard-old and faded from decades of washing. No one noticed it. If they did, they assumed it was from a long-disbanded unit or perhaps a training squad. It had become a part of the uniform, like any other nameplate. Outside, a pair of jeeps rolled onto the base's perimeter road. Soldiers tensed into practiced rhythm. The inspection was close. A sergeant called for all logistics personnel to clean up the area and make it presentable. Clear the dock. Get the place squared away. He barked. Marie stepped aside, letting younger soldiers rush around in a flurry of cleaning, organizing, and last-minute sorting. One bumped into her shoulder while carrying a box. "Sorry, ma'am," he muttered without looking back. She turned and adjusted. The box before it could slide out of his grasp. On the wall, above the loading bay, a digital clock ticked to 8:57. Private Hernandez approached, visibly flustered. "Ma'am, do you know where the sealant compound is?" "Crate B41 isn't logged in." Marie pointed to a nearby shelf. "Left side, behind the water purification cartridges." He stared for a second. "How did you know I packed it?" He blinked. "Right. Thanks." She watched him scurry off, a quiet hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips before she returned to her clipboard. From the outside, the depot looked like a mess of noise, tension, and caffeine-fueled stress. From her position, it was a system, everything in its place, even when people didn't see it. The inspection party would arrive at exactly 900 hours. General Darnell would walk in first, tall, clean-cut, with ribbons stacked across his chest like colored shields. Behind him would be aides, 2 captains, and a junior public affairs officer holding a tablet. Anne-Marie Riener would continue her work, invisible among the machinery of war, carrying secrets that no one in that room could imagine. But today, something would change. Today, someone would finally see the patch that told a story decades in the making. The inspection party entered the building at exactly 900 hours. General Darnell walked in first, tall and clean-cut, with ribbons stacked across his chest like colored shields. Behind him were aides, 2 captains, and a junior public affairs officer holding a tablet. "All personnel at attention," barked the lead aide. Everyone in the room straightened, forming an imperfect line near the loading area, all except Marie, who stood off to the side, flipping through pages of her manifest log. A young corporal beside her nudged her gently. "Miss Riener, you're supposed to stand down tools." She didn't look up. "Civilians don't stand at attention." The corporal cleared his throat awkwardly and focused forward. General Darnell began moving through the depot, stopping at stacks of gear, occasionally asking questions, glancing at manifests. The captains made notes while the aides checked their inspection boxes. He seemed neither impressed nor disappointed, just efficient. Marie moved behind the line of soldiers, noting a misfiled crate number on her log. She crouched to correct the label, her knee popping softly as she adjusted her stance. A private rolled his eyes. Can she even get up again without help? A few quiet laughs rippled through the nearby soldiers. Marie didn't respond. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a new shipping label, neatly printing the updated code with careful handwriting. From the corner of the room, a young lieutenant made his way toward the general, clearly looking to make an impression. "Sir, most of the personnel here are sharp, responsive, though some of our legacy hires are less agile." General Darnell gave a non-committal grunt. The lieutenant continued, gesturing subtly toward Marie. "That one's been here for years. Good record, I think. She mostly sticks to paperwork. Bit of a legend, I hear. Those stories like that tend to get bigger with age." Darnell didn't respond. Marie moved past the conversation, clearly within earshot. She didn't flinch. She simply continued her routine, checking a bin for hazardous materials compliance. The whispers grew bolder as the inspection continued. "Heard she was a desk jockey." "Her whole career," one soldier muttered to another. "Never saw real action. That's why she ended up here. Couldn't cut it in the field." "Makes sense," his companion replied. "I mean, look at her. Probably spent her whole service pushing papers, while real soldiers did the hard work." Marie's hand tightened slightly around her clipboard, but her expression remained unchanged. She had heard worse over the years. The assumptions, the dismissals, the casual cruelty of being invisible. She had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, at least not with words. A young female soldier, new to the base and eager to fit in, giggled as she watched Marie struggle slightly with a heavy crate. Should we call someone to help the old lady before she hurts herself? The laughter spread, creating a ripple of mockery that seemed to follow Marie as she moved through her tasks. But something else was happening too, something the laughing soldiers didn't notice. Private Rodriguez, an older soldier who had seen deployments overseas, wasn't laughing. He watched Marie work with a different expression, something like recognition, flickering in his eyes. He had seen that kind of precision before, that economy of movement that spoke of training most soldiers never received. "Leave her alone," he said quietly to the soldier beside him. "She knows what she's doing." But his voice was lost in the general chatter and the noise of the inspection. The general's eyes passed over each soldier, then over the work area, then settled on Marie. Something made him pause. She was standing still, holding a clipboard, her gaze fixed on the contents of a bin. The sunlight from the window caught her uniform just right, and that's when he saw it. His footsteps stopped abruptly. The room didn't notice yet. He took 2 slow steps forward, his brows tightening. The patch on Marie's chest, faded gold outline of a winged dagger wrapped in laurel, suddenly came into focus. His breath caught. That symbol. He knew that symbol. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the depot's ambient noise. Marie turned her head calmly, still holding her clipboard. The room began to quiet as soldiers sensed a shift in the general's demeanor. His voice dropped slightly. "Where did you get that patch?" A sudden hush began to fall over the room. Soldiers glanced sideways at each other, unsure what was happening. The lieutenant who had been making jokes about Marie's age suddenly looked uncertain. Marie looked down at her chest, as if noticing the patch for the first time that day. "Which one?" He pointed with the edge of his clipboard. "Left chest." "That one." She looked down at it, her hand brushing over the patch lightly. The faded insignia was barely visible after decades of washing, but to someone who knew what to look for, it was unmistakable. "That's not in the current unit registry," he said, his voice tightening with something between confusion and recognition. "It wouldn't be," Marie replied quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Every soldier in the depot was now watching, sensing that something significant was unfolding, though they couldn't yet understand what. General Darnell took another step closer. His aide looked confused. One of the captains stepped forward as if to intervene, but the general held up a hand to stop them. The patch told a story that most people would never be cleared to hear. And Marie Reiner, the woman they had spent the morning mocking, was about to become the center of a moment that would change everything. Task Force Midas, Operation Grip Hawk. The words hit the room like a dropped crate. They didn't mean anything to most of the soldiers, but the general's reaction made it clear they should. His expression shifted from confusion to something else, something deeper, more urgent. "You were on Midas?" he asked, more breath than voice now. Neri nodded once. The room was silent, though no one quite knew why yet. They all felt that something had changed. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with an energy that made even the most casual observer straighten unconsciously. Darnell took one slow step forward. "I was in the 212 Support Division during the Grani breach. Your unit covered our withdrawal." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I thought your squad was wiped out." "Most were," Marie said softly. "Some weren't?" The lieutenant who had been making jokes about her age was now pale. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The soldiers who had been laughing moments before stood frozen, beginning to understand that they had been mocking someone whose service they couldn't even comprehend. Private Rodriguez stepped forward slightly, his eyes wide with recognition. "Task Force Midas," he whispered to the soldier beside him. "I heard stories about them in Afghanistan. Black Ops stuff. The kind of unit that doesn't officially exist." The general stood perfectly still, staring at Marie as memories flooded back. "You're Sergeant Major Reener." I was. The name echoed in his memory. His mouth opened, then closed again. He straightened, his hand lifting to his forehead in a crisp, practiced salute. "Sergeant Major," he said clearly, his voice carrying. Across the silent depot, "It's an honor." And then the entire room saw it. The general of the base was saluting a woman they had spent the morning mocking. A woman they hadn't looked at twice. A woman with a patch they didn't recognize now. Being honored by one of the highest-ranking officers in the region. Marie hesitated for just a moment, then returned the salute with steady precision. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time in years, everyone in the room truly saw her. And she didn't say a word she didn't need to. But the moment was just beginning. One of the younger privates, the same one who had called her grandma earlier, was shaking his head in disbelief. "No way," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. "She's just some old logistics lady. This has to be some kind of mistake." His words cut through the sacred silence like a blade. Several soldiers turned to look at him, their expressions ranging from shock to disapproval, but the damage was done. The general's expression hardened. "What did you say, Private?" The young man realized his mistake immediately, but it was too late to take it back. I just meant, "Sir, she works in supply. She files papers." How could she have been in some elite unit? The room tension ratcheted up another notch. Marie stood perfectly still, but something flickered in her eyes, not anger, but a deep, weary sadness. This was the moment she had dreaded, the reason she had chosen obscurity over recognition. "Because, Private," the general said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you don't know what you're looking at. You see an old woman in logistics. I see someone who saved more lives than you'll ever know, in places you'll never go, doing things that will never appear in any history book you'll ever read." The private's face flushed red, but another soldier nearby wasn't ready to let it go. "Come on, sir. With all due respect, she's been here for years. If she was really some kind of war hero, wouldn't we know about it?" Marie finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying clearly across the depot. "You know what you needed to know. That your supplies arrive on time, that your equipment works, that when you deploy, someone made sure you had what you needed to come home." The second soldier persisted, his skepticism overriding his military discipline. "But Task Force Midas? That sounds like something out of a movie." "No offense, ma'am, but you're asking us to believe." "I'm not asking you to believe anything," Marie interrupted, her voice still calm but with an edge of steel underneath. "I never asked for recognition. I never asked for thanks. I certainly never asked for your belief." The general stepped forward, positioning himself between Marie and the questioning soldiers. "Let me be clear about something," he said, his voice rising. "If even half of what she did had been declassified, she would have medals stacked to her shoulder, and most of us in this room would owe her for battles we didn't even know she fought. But the damage was spreading. The questions, the doubts, the casual dismissal of her service. It was exactly what Marie had spent years trying to avoid. She could feel the weight of every secret mission, every lost teammate, every classified operation settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. One of the captains from the inspection team stepped forward, consulting his tablet. "Sir, I'm not showing any record of a Task Force Midas in the standard databases." "Of course you're not," the general snapped. "It's classified above your clearance level, above most of our clearance levels." Marie closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and looked directly at the general. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to return to my duties. The morning shipment still needs to be processed." It was a retreat, and everyone in the room recognized it. The woman who had just been revealed as a decorated war hero was asking. To go back to filing paperwork, to return to the shadows where she had been comfortable. The general's jaw tightened. He could see what was happening, the doubt, the questioning, the slow erosion of the moment that should have been her vindication. And he realized that Marie Reiner, who had faced enemy fire and classified missions, was facing something that might be even harder. The disbelief of people she had spent years serving alongside. No, he said firmly. You won't be returning to routine duties, not today. Because this room is about to learn exactly who you are and what you've done for this country. Marie looked at him with something that might have been fear. Sir, I'd prefer. I know what you'd prefer. Sergeant Major. But some stories need to be told, whether the hero wants them told or not. The confrontation was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. General Donnell turned sharply to his aide, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. Captain Morrison, get me Colonel Hayes from Central Archives on secure line. Now. The aide fumbled with his communication device, clearly confused but not willing to question. Direct order. The depot remained silent, every soldier frozen in place as they watched the scene unfold. Marie stepped forward slightly. Sir, this isn't necessary. It absolutely is necessary. Darnell cut her off. Private, you wanted proof? Captain, you can't find records? You're about to get both. The communication device crackled to life. Colonel Hayes, this is General Darnell. I need immediate verification on classified personnel records for Task Force Midas. Operation Grip Hawk, time frame 20 years ago. I'm particularly interested in one Sergeant Major Marie Reiner. There was a pause. Then Hayes's voice came through clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Sir, I'll need to verify your authorization for that level of classified material. Authorization code Delta 77 Tango Mike. And Hayes, I need this information now, not next week. Another pause, longer this time. The sound of typing could be heard through the speaker. Then Hayes's voice returned, noticeably more respectful. Sir, I'm showing Task Force Midas as a classified joint operations unit, operational from ... double quotes more typing, from approximately 18 to 23 years ago. Sergeant Major Marie Reiner is listed as team leader for multiple high-value target extractions and behind-the-lines reconnaissance missions. The depot was dead silent. Even the soldiers who had been skeptical were now staring at Marie with new eyes. Continue, Colonel. Sir, her record shows ... Jesus. Hayes's voice carried genuine surprise. 3 bronze stars, 2 silver stars, a Distinguished Service Cross, and a Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster, all classified commendations. Her file is flagged with the highest security clearance. Most of her operational history is sealed, but what I can see ... Sir, this woman is a legitimate war hero. The private who had called her grandma that morning looked like he might be sick. Several other soldiers were shaking their heads in disbelief, but not the kind of disbelief that questioned the truth, the kind that questioned their own blindness. General Darnell looked around the room slowly, letting the weight of the revelation settle on everyone present. Colonel Hayes, can you tell us about Operation Grip Hawk specifically? Sir, that's above my clearance level. I can see that it happened. I can see that it was successful, and I can see that Sergeant Major Reiner was instrumental in its success. But the details are sealed at a level that requires special authorization even for me to access. Darnell nodded. Thank you, Colonel. Send me everything you can release to my secure terminal within the hour. Yes, sir. The communication ended, leaving the depot in profound silence. Mary stood exactly where she had been, her expression unchanged, but something in her posture suggested she was preparing for what came next. Private Rodriguez, the older soldier who had tried to defend her earlier, stepped forward hesitantly. Ma'am, I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. I heard stories about a unit that operated behind enemy lines, pulling out high-value targets, gathering intelligence that saved hundreds of lives. We called them ghosts because they were never officially there. Was that ... Marie looked at him for a long moment. Some stories shouldn't be told, son. But some should, General Darnell interjected firmly. Rodriguez, you're absolutely right. Task Force Midas was exactly what you heard about. They operated in places that officially didn't exist, did things that officially never happened, and saved lives that officially were never in danger. He turned to address the entire room. What you're looking at, soldiers, is someone who spent 5 years of her life in the deepest, most dangerous assignments this military has ever conducted. While you were sleeping safely in your beds, she was extracting prisoners of war from behind enemy lines. While you were complaining about mess hall food, she was surviving on cold rations for weeks at a time in hostile territory. The lieutenant who had made jokes about her earlier was visibly shaken. Ma'am, I had no idea. The things I said ... Marie's voice was gentle but firm. You said what you saw. That's not your fault. But Darnell wasn't ready to let it go. Actually, Lieutenant, it is your fault. Because a good officer observes before he judges. A good officer recognizes that just because something isn't obvious doesn't mean it isn't there. The young officer nodded, his face flushed with shame. Yes, sir. You're absolutely right, sir. One of the captains from the inspection team stepped forward. Sir, if Sergeant Major Reener's service record is as distinguished as Colonel Hayes indicated, why is she working in logistics? Shouldn't someone with her qualifications be in a leadership position? Marie answered before the general could speak. Because I chose this, Captain. After 5 years of classified operations, after losing teammates whose names I can't even speak aloud, after missions that will never be declassified in our lifetime, I chose to serve in a way that let me help people without carrying a weapon. She gestured around the depot. Every piece of equipment that goes out these doors properly tagged and properly functional might save someone's life. Every supply shipment that arrives on schedule means a unit doesn't go without food or ammunition. This work matters, Captain. It just matters quietly. The captain nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. Yes, ma'am. I can see. That now, Private Hernandez, who had asked her about supply locations earlier, stepped forward. Ma'am, when I asked you about the seal and compound, you knew exactly where it was. And earlier, when you corrected that cable code error, you knew the specifications by heart. That's not just paperwork knowledge, is it? Marie smiled slightly, the first genuine smile anyone in the room had seen from her. No, son. When your life depends on equipment working perfectly, you learn every specification, every compatibility issue, every failure point by heart. Old habits. The room was beginning to transform. Where there had been mockery and dismissal, there was now respect and curiosity. But Marie could sense something else building something that made her uncomfortable. Sir, she said to General Darnell, I appreciate what you're doing, but I'd prefer not to become a spectacle. I chose obscurity for good reasons. Darnell studied her face carefully. I understand your preference, Sergeant Major, but sometimes the choice isn't ours to make. Sometimes the truth has to come out, whether we want it to or not. Marie felt a chill run down her spine. She had spent years carefully constructing a life where her past remained buried, where she could serve without the weight of recognition or the burden of being seen as anything other than an ordinary logistics coordinator. Now that carefully constructed life was crumbling around her, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what would take its place. Word traveled fast on a military base. By the time the inspection ended, soldiers throughout the compound were hearing whispered versions of what had happened in the logistics depot. The story grew with each telling, some versions accurate, others embellished, but all carrying the same central truth. Mari Reiner was not who they thought she was. In the mess hall during lunch, conversations buzzed with speculation. Did you hear about the old lady in supply? Turns out she's some kind of black ops legend. No way, really? The one who's always checking manifests? That's the one. General Darnell saluted her in front of everybody. Meanwhile, Marie tried to return to her normal routine, but it proved impossible. Soldiers who had ignored her for years were now approaching with questions, requests for advice, and poorly concealed stares. Some wanted to thank her for her service. Others simply wanted to be near someone who had become an instant legend. She found herself longing for the anonymity she had lost. Captain Morrison, General Darnell's aide, appeared at her desk around 1400 hours. "Ma'am, the General requests your presence in his office at your earliest convenience." Marie set down her clipboard. "Is this a request or an order, Captain?" "Ma'am, the General was very clear that this was a request. He said to tell you that. You could decline if you preferred." She considered it for a moment. "Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes. General Darnell's office was sparse but functional, with maps covering one wall and commendations covering another. He gestured for Marie to sit in the chair across from his desk. "First," he said, "I want to apologize for what happened this morning. I know you value your privacy, and I may have compromised that irreversibly." Marie nodded. "You did what you felt was right, sir. I can't fault you for that. Second, I want you to know that Colonel Hayes sent over everything he could declassify about your service record. Marie, what you did, what your team accomplished, it's extraordinary." She was quiet for a moment. "A lot of good people didn't come home from those missions, sir. That's what I remember most. Which is exactly why your story needs to be preserved somehow. Not for glory, not for recognition, but so that people understand the cost of the freedoms they take for granted." Marie shook her head. "With respect, sir, I didn't serve for recognition then, and I don't want it now. The work was classified. For good reasons. Some of those reasons haven't changed." Darnell leaned forward. "I'm not talking about declassifying operational details. I'm talking about acknowledging that people like you existed, that they served with honor, and that their sacrifice meant something." "To what end?" "Because right now, there are young soldiers on this base who think logistics is busy work for people who couldn't cut it in combat. Because there are officers who don't understand the supply chain is just as critical as the front line. Because there are people who need to know that heroism doesn't always look like what they see in movies." Marie was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Nothing public. Nothing that would compromise operational security. But I'd like to recommend you for a position training logistics officers at the academy. Share your knowledge, your perspective. Help the next generation understand what they're really doing when they manage supply chains." She looked out the window at the base compound, watching soldiers go about their daily routines. "And if I say no, then you say no. You go back to your depot, and I make sure everyone understands that your privacy is to be respected absolutely." "But," Darnell smiled slightly, "but I think you're too good a soldier to walk away from a mission that could make a real difference." Mari stood up, pacing to the window. "The soldiers who served with me, the ones who didn't come home, they'd probably want their story told. They'd want people to understand what they gave up." "I think they would." She turned back to face him. "If I agree to this, I have conditions. Name them. First, no media attention. No interviews, no public ceremonies, no publicity of any kind. Second, any stories I share in training scenarios are sanitized of operational details. Third, I maintain my current position in logistics training would be additional duty, not a replacement. Darnell nodded, agreed on all counts. And fourth, Marie continued, we find a way to honor the teammates who didn't make it home. I won't be the face of Task Force Midas when I wasn't the only one who served. We'll make it happen. Marie extended her hand. Then I accept, sir. As they shook hands, Darnell said, there's one more thing. This evening, I'm having dinner with the senior staff. I'd like you to join us. Not as a guest of honor, just as a colleague. It might help normalize things after this morning's revelation. Marie hesitated. Sir, I'm not sure that's wise. Some of your staff might not be comfortable. Marie, he interrupted, using her first name for the first time. You've spent enough years making everyone else comfortable. Tonight, we make sure you're comfortable for a change. That evening, as Marie prepared for dinner with the senior staff, she found herself looking in the mirror at a woman she barely recognized. For so many years, she had been invisible, overlooked, dismissed. Now, suddenly, she was seen, perhaps more clearly than she had ever wanted to be. She touched the faded patch on her uniform, thinking of the teammates who would never have the chance to be recognized, never have the opportunity to tell their stories, never get to see the impact their sacrifices had made. Maybe it was time to speak for them, even if she had never wanted to speak for herself. The real test would come at dinner, when she would have to navigate being seen as both the logistics coordinator she had become and the elite soldier she had been. She wasn't. Sure, she was ready for that balance, but she was beginning to realize that ready or not, the choice was no longer entirely hers to make. The senior staff dining room was more formal than Marie had expected. White tablecloths, proper place settings, and the kind of military precision that spoke to both tradition and hierarchy. As she entered, conversations quieted noticeably. 6 officers were already seated around the table, with General Darnell at the head. Sergeant Major Reener, Darnell announced as she approached. Please, take the seat to my right. The placement was significant, a position of honor that everyone in the room would recognize. Marie hesitated for just a moment before accepting the chair. Colonel Patricia Webb, the base's second-in-command, was the first to speak. Ms. Reener, I have to say, today's revelation has been quite surprising. I've been reviewing your personnel file, and frankly, I'm having difficulty reconciling the woman who's been processing our shipping manifests with the soldier described in your classified records. There was something in Webb's tone, not quite hostile, but skeptical, probing. Marie recognized the challenge immediately. I'm the same person I've always been, Colonel. The work may be different, but the attention to detail remains the same. Major Harrison, the logistics commander, leaned forward. With all due respect, ma'am, some of us are wondering why someone with your qualifications has been content to work in such a limited capacity. If your record is as distinguished as we're hearing, wouldn't you want to be in a position where you could have more impact? Marie set her water glass down carefully. Major, are you suggesting that ensuring this base's supply chain functions properly is somehow less important than other duties? Not less important, exactly, but, well, it seems like a waste of your skills. General Darnell started to intervene, but Marie raised her hand slightly. No, sir, it's a fair question. She looked directly at Major Harrison. Major, in your opinion, what happens if a forward operating base receives the wrong ammunition for their weapons? Well, obviously, that would be a serious problem. People die, Marie interrupted quietly. What happens if medical supplies are delayed because someone filed the wrong shipping code? That would also be people die, she repeated. What happens if the wrong grade of fuel is delivered to a motor pool before a critical mission? Harrison was beginning to look uncomfortable. I see your point. No, Major, I don't think you do. Marie's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. Every single piece of equipment that moves through my depot could mean the difference. between a soldier coming home to their family or not coming home at all. You call that limited impact. I call it the most important job on this base. Colonel Webb interjected. But surely someone with your combat experience would be more valuable in a training or operational role. Would I? Marie asked. Colonel, how many logistics personnel have you lost in the past year due to errors that could have been prevented by someone who understands both the equipment and the stakes? Webb paused, clearly thinking. 3 minor incidents, but nothing serious. Define nothing serious. Well, non-delayed medical supply shipment, 1 ammunition compatibility issue that was caught before deployment, and 1 vehicle breakdown due to wrong parts. Marie nodded. The delayed medical supplies, was that the shipment to Forward Operating Base Martinez? Webb checked her notes. Yes. How did you? Because I'm the one who caught the error and expedited the correct supplies. The soldier who needed emergency surgery received his treatment 12 hours sooner because I personally drove the medical kit to the airfield at 0300 hours. The room fell silent. Webb's expression shifted from skeptical to something approaching embarrassment. The ammunition compatibility issue, Marie continued, was caught because I noticed that someone had requested 5.56 ammunition for weapons that fire 7.62. The vehicle breakdown happened because someone ordered parts for a different engine model. I caught that one too, but the paperwork was already processed, so the wrong parts were delivered first. Major Harrison was staring at his plate. I wasn't aware you were involved in resolving those issues. Of course you weren't, because that's not how I work. I don't send memos about problems I fix. I just fix them. Colonel Webb sat down. Her fork. Ms. Rena, I owe you an apology. We all do. It appears we've been taking credit for problem solving that you've been doing behind the scenes. General Garnell finally spoke. This is exactly why I wanted Marie to join us tonight. Not to be honored or celebrated, but so you could understand what's been happening right under our noses for years. Lieutenant Colonel James Parker, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. Ma'am, if I may ask ... Why didn't you ever speak? Up? Why didn't you make sure people knew what you were contributing? Marie was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Because the mission isn't about recognition, Colonel. It's about results. In Task Force Midas, we learned that the best operations are the ones that nobody ever hears about. The best. Work is often invisible work. But surely you deserve credit. Do I? Marie interrupted. For doing my job? For preventing problems before they become crises? That's not heroic, Colonel. That's just competent. Captain Rodriguez, the youngest officer at the table, spoke up hesitantly. Ma'am, with respect, I think there's a difference between competent and ... It is you do. I mean, knowing specifications by heart, catching errors that others miss, predicting problems before they happen. That's not normal competence. Marie smiled slightly. Captain, when you've spent 5 years in situations where a single mistake could get your entire team killed, you develop certain habits. Attention to detail becomes second nature. Anticipating problems becomes survival. Is that what Task Force Midas was like? He asked. The question hung in the air. Marie glanced at General Darnell, who nodded slightly. Captain, most of what we did remains classified, and it needs to stay that way. But I can tell you this, we operated in environments where there was no backup, no second chances, and no margin for error. Every piece of equipment had to work perfectly. Every supply calculation had to be exact. Every contingency had to be planned for. She paused, looking around the table. When you live that way for 5 years, when people you care about depend on your precision for their lives, it changes how you approach everything, even something as routine as processing supply orders. Major Harrison leaned back in his chair. So when you're checking shipping manifests, you're not just making sure the paperwork is correct. You're making sure soldiers have what they need to survive. Exactly. Colonel Webb shook her head slowly. And we've been treating you like you. We're just filing papers. You've been treating me exactly how I wanted to be treated, Marie replied. Anonymous, unnoticed, able to do my job without having to explain myself or justify my methods. But that's not fair to you, Captain Rodriguez protested. Fair isn't the point, Captain. Effective is the point. General Darnell intervened. Which brings us to why we're really here tonight. Marie has agreed to take on additional duties training logistics officers at the Academy. She'll be sharing her expertise with the next generation of supply chain managers. Lieutenant Colonel. Parker raised an eyebrow. With respect, sir, is that wise? I mean, if her methods are based on classified operations experience, her methods are based on understanding that logistics isn't just about moving boxes from point A to point B, Darnell replied. It's about understanding that every decision in the supply chain has tactical implications. That's not classified. Knowledge is just knowledge that most people never acquire, because they never operate in situations where lives depend on getting it right. Marie added, I won't be sharing operational details, Colonel. I'll be sharing perspective, teaching officers to think systematically, to anticipate problems, to understand that their decisions have consequences beyond their immediate area of responsibility. And frankly, General Darnell continued, given the number of supply chain issues we've had across multiple bases this year, we need officers who understand what Marie understands. The conversation continued through dinner, but the tone had shifted completely. Where there had been skepticism and veiled challenges, there was now genuine respect and curiosity. Officers who had begun the evening questioning Marie's qualifications ended at asking for her advice on specific problems they were facing. As the evening wound down, Colonel Webb approached Marie privately. Ms. Rena, I want to apologize again for my attitude earlier. I was wrong, and I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment. We all make assumptions, Colonel. The important thing is being willing to examine them when new information becomes available. Is that something you learned in Task Force Midas too? Marie smiled. No, Colonel. That's something I learned from making mistakes and having to live with the consequences. As Marie prepared to leave, General Darnell walked her to the door. How do you feel about tonight? Honestly, exhausted. I'd forgotten how tiring it can be to be seen. Any regrets about accepting the training position? Marie considered the question. Ask me again in 6 months, sir, but I think maybe it's time to stop hiding from who I used to be. And who are you now? She paused at the door, looking back at the dining room where officers were still discussing supply chain strategies with a newfound appreciation for their complexity. I'm someone who remembers that every job in the military matters, and every person doing that job deserves to understand why their work is important. Maybe that's worth coming out of the shadows for. As she walked back to her quarters, Marie reflected on how much had changed in a single day. This morning, she had been invisible. Tonight, she was perhaps more visible than she had ever wanted to be. But for the first time in years, she felt like she might be able to carry both versions of herself, the elite soldier she had been and the logistics coordinator she had become, without having to choose between them. The real test would come when she stood in front of her first class of academy students and tried to teach them lessons that had been learned in blood and silence, in places that didn't officially exist, during operations that would never be declassified. She was beginning to think she might be ready for that challenge. 3 weeks later, Marie stood before her first class at the Logistics Academy. 30 young officers, fresh from basic training, sat in neat rows with notebooks open and expressions ranging from eager to skeptical. She had spent days preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, She felt the familiar calm that had always preceded her most important missions. "Good morning," she began simply. "I'm Marie Reiner, and I'm here to teach you something that most people don't understand. Logistics isn't support. Logistics is warfare." A hand shot up immediately. "Ma'am, how is moving supplies warfare?" "Good." Question, Lieutenant ... double quote. She checked her roster. "Mitchell, let me answer that with a scenario. You're responsible for supplying a forward operating base. Your convoy is scheduled to deliver rations, ammunition, and medical supplies. Due to a paperwork error, the convoy is delayed by 6 hours. What's the tactical impact?" Lieutenant Mitchell looked confused. "Well, the base would have to wait. 6 hours for supplies, but think deeper, Lieutenant. What happens during those 6 hours?" Another student, Captain Davis, raised her hand. "The base would have to ration existing supplies?" "Possibly. What else?" The class was quiet for a moment. Then a young man in the back row, Lieutenant Johnson, spoke up hesitantly. "If they're rationing ammunition, they might not be able to respond effectively to contact. Better keep going. And if medical supplies are delayed, anyone who gets injured during those 6 hours might not receive proper treatment." "Exactly. Now, what if the delay isn't 6 hours? What if it's 6 days?" The room was beginning to understand. Faces that had seemed bored were now focused, engaged. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Mitchell said, his tone completely different now, "you're saying that a logistics error could actually cost lives?" "I'm not saying it could, Lieutenant. I'm saying it has. Many times." She moved to the whiteboard and drew a simple diagram, a supply line stretching from a depot to a forward base, with multiple decision points along the way. Every decision point in this chain is a place where someone in logistics makes a choice. Ship now or wait for a full load. Use standard transport or expedited delivery. Route through the secure path or the faster path. Each choice has tactical implications. Captain Davis raised her hand again. "Ma'am, how do we learn to see those implications? I mean, how do we know which choices matter most?" Marie paused, remembering General Darnell's words about sharing perspective without sharing operational details. "You learn by understanding that you're not just moving objects. You're moving capabilities. When you ship ammunition, you're shipping the ability to engage the enemy. When you ship medical supplies, you're shipping the ability to save lives. When you ship food, you're shipping the ability to maintain operational readiness." She turned back to the board and added arrows connecting different elements of the supply chain. "But it goes deeper than that. You also need to understand failure modes. What happens if this convoy doesn't arrive? What's the backup plan? What's the backup to the backup plan?" Lieutenant Johnson leaned forward. "Ma'am, that sounds like operational planning, not logistics." "Good observation, Lieutenant. Where do you think the line is between logistics and operations?" The class considered this. Finally, Captain Davis spoke up. "Maybe there isn't one? Maybe they're all part of the same system." Marie smiled, the first genuine smile she'd allowed herself in the classroom. "Excellent, Captain. That's exactly right. The best logistics officers understand that they're not separate from operations. They're integral to operations." She spent the next hour walking them through increasingly complex scenarios, each one building on the lessons of the previous one. A delayed fuel shipment that prevented air support during a critical mission. A medical supply error that left a field hospital without blood products during a mass casualty event. A communication equipment failure that isolated a unit during enemy contact. With each scenario, the students became more engaged, more understanding of the weight that logistics decisions carried. Near the end of the class, Lieutenant Mitchell raised his hand again. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, how do you know all this? I mean, The scenarios you're describing are so specific, double quotes. Marie had been expecting this question. Because I've seen what happens when logistics fails, Lieutenant. And I've seen what happens when it succeeds. Both experiences teach you things that no textbook can. Have you ever been in a situation where your logistics decisions directly impacted a mission? This was the moment Marie had been preparing for how to answer honestly without violating classification rules. Yes, Lieutenant, many times. And I can tell you that the weight of knowing that your decisions could mean the difference between soldiers coming home safely or not coming home. At all ... It changes how you approach every aspect of your job. The room was completely silent now. These young officers were beginning to understand that they weren't just being trained to manage supplies. They were being trained to hold lives in their hands. "Ma'am," Captain Davis said quietly, "how do you handle that kind of pressure?" "By being better than good enough," Marie replied. "By checking everything twice. By anticipating problems before they happen. By understanding that your job isn't just to follow procedures. It's to think beyond procedures." As the class ended and students filed out, several approached her with additional questions. Their eagerness reminded her of herself decades ago. Hungry to understand not just what to do, but why it mattered. Lieutenant Johnson was the last to leave. "Ma'am, thank you for today. I came in thinking logistics was just, boring support work. I'm starting to understand that it's actually..." "What, Lieutenant?" "It's actually one of the most important jobs in the military." That evening, Marie sat in her quarters, writing a letter she had been meaning to write for weeks. It was addressed to the families of her former teammates, the ones who hadn't made it home from Task Force Midas operations. She had located most of them through military records, and with General Darnell's help, she had been given permission to share certain non-classified information about their service. The letters were difficult to write. How do you tell a widow that her husband died a hero when you can't tell her how or where or why? How do you explain to children that their father's sacrifice mattered when you can't explain what he sacrificed himself for? But she persevered because she had made a promise to herself that their service would be acknowledged, even if it couldn't be fully explained. 2 weeks later, she received her first response. It was from Margaret Thompson, whose husband David had died during Operation Grip Hawk. "Dear Ms. Rayner," the letter began, "thank you for writing to tell me about David's service with Task Force Midas. For 20 years, I've known only that he died in the line of duty. To learn that he served with honor alongside people like you, that his sacrifice contributed to missions that saved other lives, it means more than you can know." The letter continued for 2 pages, sharing memories of David that Marie hadn't known, describing the man behind the soldiers she had served with. It ended with a request that surprised her. "If you're ever able to share more about David's service, even years from now, I would be grateful to know. Not for curiosity, but so I can tell his children who their father really was." Similar letters arrived from other families. Each one was different, but they all carried the same theme: gratitude for acknowledgement and hope that someday more of the truth could be told. A month after her first class, General Darnell called Marie to his office. "I've been getting reports from the academy," he said as she sat down. "Your students are performing at levels we haven't seen in years. They're good students, sir. They just needed to understand why their work matters. It's more than that, Marie. They're thinking differently. They're approaching problems with a level of sophistication that usually takes years to develop. What happens next? Next, we expand the program. I want you to develop a curriculum for senior logistics officers. And I want you to consider something else." Marie waited. "The Defense Department is conducting a review of logistics training across all branches. They're looking for new approaches, new perspectives. I'd like to recommend you as a consultant for that review." Marie was quiet for a long moment, Sir, that would mean. It would mean your influence would extend far beyond this base. It would mean that the lessons you learned, the perspective you gained, could impact logistics training throughout the entire military. It would also mean more visibility than I'm comfortable with, I know. But Marie, you've proven something important over the past month. You've proven that you can honor your past service while building something meaningful for the future. You've found a way to tell the stories that need to be told without compromising the secrets that need to be kept. Marie looked out the window at the base compound, watching young soldiers go about their daily routines. Some of them might someday find themselves in situations where their lives depended on the competence of a logistics officer they would never meet. If I agree to this, she said finally, I want to propose something. What's that? A memorial. Not for Task Force Midas specifically, but for all the classified operations personnel who served in units that officially don't exist. People whose families never got full closure, whose service was never publicly acknowledged, whose sacrifices were hidden for national security reasons. General Darnell nodded slowly. That's actually a brilliant idea. A way to honor the service without compromising the secrecy. It wouldn't include names or operational details, just acknowledgement that they existed, that they served, and that their service mattered. I think we can make that happen. Marie stood up and extended her hand. Then yes, sir. I accept the consulting position. As they shook hands, Darnell said, You know, when I first saw that patch on your uniform, I thought I was honoring the past. I didn't realize I was also looking at the future. That evening, Marie returned to the logistics depot for the first time in weeks. It looked exactly the same, but felt completely different. The same crates, the same manifests, the same quiet efficiency. But now she saw it through new eyes. This was where her real mission had always been. Not in the classified operations of her past, but in the quiet work of ensuring that others could complete their mission successfully. The difference was that now she understood both roles were part of the same service. She picked up a shipping manifest and began checking serial numbers, just as she had done thousands of times before. But this time, she could see clearly how this work connected to the bigger picture, how every correctly filled order, every properly timed shipment, every accurately coded requisition was part of a vast network of decisions that ultimately determined whether soldiers came home safely. For the first time in decades, Marie Reiner felt complete. She was no longer hiding from her past or diminishing her present. She was simply serving, with all the skill and dedication she possessed, in whatever capacity was needed most. And that, she realized, was what real honor looked like. 6 months later, Marie stood on a small platform overlooking the newly dedicated memorial to unnamed warriors. The granite monument was simple but elegant, a black stone wall engraved with the words, "In honor of those who served in shadows, whose names cannot be spoken, whose missions cannot be told, but whose sacrifice illuminated the path of freedom." Below the inscription was a bronze plaque that read, "Their stories remain classified, but their service remains forever." General Darnell spoke to the small crowd that had gathered for the dedication. This memorial represents something we've never had before, a way to acknowledge service that, by necessity, cannot be fully revealed. For the families of those who served in classified operations, for the veterans who carry secrets they can never share, and for the active personnel who continue this vital work, this memorial says simply, we know, we remember, we honor your sacrifice. Marie had been asked to speak, but she had declined. This moment wasn't about her. It was about all the people whose service would never be publicly acknowledged, whose families would never know the full truth about their loved ones' sacrifices. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, a woman approached Marie hesitantly. "Excuse me, Are you Marie Rina? Yes. My name is Jennifer Walsh. My father was Captain Robert Walsh. He died during a classified operation about 20 years ago. I heard that you might have known him. Marie's breath caught. Bobby Walsh had been Task Force Midas's communications specialist, a young man with an infectious laugh who had been killed during Operation Griphawk. She had carried the weight of his death for 2 decades. I did know your father, Marie said carefully. He was a good soldier and a good man. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. Would you be able to tell me anything about him? About how he died? My mother passed away last year, and I've been trying to learn more about his service. Marie looked at the memorial wall, then back at Jennifer. Your father saved lives. I can't tell you the specifics, but I can tell you that his actions during his final mission ensured that other soldiers made it home to their families. He was brave, and he was heroic, and he died doing work that mattered enormously to our countries. Security. Jennifer wiped her eyes. Thank you. That means everything to hear. Your father used to carry a picture of you in his gear, Marie continued. You were about 7 years old in the photo, wearing a baseball uniform. He told everyone who would listen that you were going to be the first woman to play in the major leagues. Jennifer laughed through her tears. I did play softball in college. Never made it to the majors, but I became a teacher instead. Dad would have been proud of that too, I think. I know he would have been. After Jennifer left, Marie remained at the memorial for a while, reading the names that visitors had left on small pieces of paper tucked into a bronze box beside the monument. Names of soldiers whose service remained classified, whose sacrifices remained secret, but whose memories remained cherished by those who loved them. Later that evening, Marie returned to her quarters to find a package waiting for her. Inside was a bound volume, Advanced Logistics Training Curriculum, authored by Marie Rina. It was the textbook based on her teaching, now being used at military academies across all branches of service. She flipped through the pages, reading lessons she had written based on experiences she had lived. The scenarios were different from the real missions she had undertaken, but the principles were the same. Understand the stakes, anticipate problems. Remember that every decision has consequences beyond your immediate area of responsibility. Her phone rang. It was General Darnell. Marie, I wanted to let you know that the Defense Department has approved your curriculum for implementation across all service branches. Your approach to logistics training is being adopted as the new standard. That's incredible. Sir, it gets better. They want to offer you a position as the Director of Logistics Education for the entire Department of Defense. You'd be based in Washington, overseeing logistics training for every branch of the military. Marie was quiet for a long moment. Sir, that's an enormous honor, but you're not sure you want to leave the field for an office in the Pentagon? Something like that. Marie, you'd be able to ensure that every logistics officer in the military receives training that could save lives. Your influence would extend to hundreds of thousands of personnel. The impact would be immeasurable. I understand that, sir. Can I have some time to think about it? Of course. Take all the time you need. After hanging up, Marie walked to her window and looked out at the base compound. Young soldiers were still moving around, completing their duties, preparing for missions, maintaining the endless cycle of military readiness. Some of them were logistics personnel who had been through her training program, now approaching their work with a deeper understanding of its importance. She thought about Bobby Walsh, about David Thompson, about all the members of Task Force Midas who hadn't lived to see their service acknowledged. She thought about their families, who were only now beginning to understand the magnitude of their loved ones' sacrifices. She thought about the young officers in her classes, eager to learn, hungry to understand how their work connected to the larger mission. She thought about the logistics personnel on bases across the country who were still being overlooked, still being dismissed as support, rather than recognized as essential components of military effectiveness. The offer from the Defense Department represented an opportunity to influence military logistics training on a scale she had never imagined possible. It would mean leaving the hands-on work she had come to love, but it would also mean ensuring that future generations of logistics officers received the kind of training that could prevent the mistakes that cost lives. The next morning, Marie made her decision. She called General Darnell and accepted the position, with one condition. She wanted to spend one day each month in the field, working directly with logistics personnel at bases around the country. She didn't want to lose touch with the day-to-day realities of the work she would be shaping from Washington. Done, Darnell said immediately. When do you start? Give me 2 weeks to transition my current responsibilities and say goodbye to the depot. 3 months later, Marie sat in a conference room in the Pentagon, reviewing logistics training reports from bases across the globe. The new curriculum was being implemented successfully, and early results showed significant improvements in supply chain efficiency and error reduction. But the report that caught her attention was from a small forward operating base in an undisclosed location. The logistics officer there, a young lieutenant named Sarah Martinez, had identified a potential supply chain vulnerability that could have compromised a critical mission. Her analysis showed exactly the kind of systematic thinking that Marie had been trying to teach. The report ended with a note. Lieutenant Martinez credits her ability to identify this issue to advanced logistics training she received. She specifically mentioned learning to think like every decision could save or cost lives as the key insight that allowed her to see the problem. Marie smiled as she read those words. They were almost exactly what she had said to her first class at the academy. That evening, she called Lieutenant Martinez directly. "Ma'am, I'm honored to hear from you," Martinez said when she realized who was calling. "Your training program changed how I approach my job entirely." "I'm glad to hear that, Lieutenant. Your report on the supply chain vulnerability was excellent work." "Thank you, ma'am. I have to ask, the way you taught us to think about logistics, to see the bigger picture, did you learn that from experience?" "Yes, Lieutenant. I learned it from making mistakes and seeing the consequences. But more importantly, I learned it from watching other people pay the price for those mistakes." "Ma'am, if I may ask, were you ever in a situation where logistics failures actually cost lives?" Marie was quiet for a moment. "Yes, Lieutenant. Several times. That's why I'm so passionate about making sure officers like you have the training to prevent those failures. It must be hard, carrying that kind of responsibility." "It is, but you know what's harder, Lieutenant. Knowing that failures could be prevented and doing nothing to prevent them. The work you're doing matters enormously, and I want you to never forget that." After ending the call, Marie looked out her office window at the Washington skyline. She was further from the field than she had ever been, but somehow closer to the mission than she had felt in years. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer Walsh. "Ms. Riener, thought you'd want to know. I just started volunteer work at a veteran support organization, helping families of deceased service members understand their benefits and honor their loved one's service. Dad would have been proud. Thank you for helping me understand who he was." Marie smiled and typed back, "He would have been incredibly proud. Thank you for carrying on his legacy of service." That night, as she prepared for bed, Marie looked at the framed photograph on her dresser, the old Task Force Midas team photo that she had carried for so many years. The faces of her fallen teammates looked back at her, frozen in time, young and determined and unaware of what lay ahead. "I think you'd approve," she said quietly to the photograph. "It took me a while to figure out how to honor your service without betraying your secrets, but I think I found a way." She turned off the light and settled into bed, thinking about the next day's meetings, the training program she was developing, the young officers who would benefit from lessons learned in blood and sacrifice decades ago. For the first time since Task Force Midas was disbanded, Marie Reiner felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. She was still serving, still protecting, still ensuring that others could complete their missions safely. The only difference was that now, her mission was no longer classified. And that, she realized as she drifted off to sleep, made all the difference in the world. Years from now, when military historians look back at the transformation of logistics training in the early 21st century, they would note the implementation of new methodologies that dramatically improved supply chain efficiency and reduced mission-critical failures. They might not know that these improvements stemmed from the insights of a woman who had spent 5 years in the deepest shadows of military service, who had learned the true cost of logistical failures in places that didn't officially exist, during operations that would never be declassified. But the soldiers whose lives were saved by more effective logistics training would benefit from her legacy, whether they knew her name or not. And for Marie Reiner, that was exactly how it should be. The best service, she had learned long ago, was often the kind that no one ever heard about. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.